But Mom, I want it. I want it now. I want it right now. You're not going to let me leave this store without having it. Mom, get it for me right now. Anybody ever experienced anything remotely close to that? Or have you ever witnessed something? Maybe don't throw your own kid under the bus. But have you ever witnessed another kid do something like, yeah, I see a lot of smiles going on out here and quite a few head nods going on. We have all witnessed at some point a temper tantrum being thrown. Turn on the news and you will see temper tantrums being thrown. We can envision those protesters out there screaming for different things, and not saying that all of their purposes are wrong, but we've all thought it at some point. Like, wow, what a grown-up temper tantrum. That's like a little kid out there, the way that they're behaving through all this. But what about yourself? Have you ever thrown yourself a little temper tantrum? You know, kind of the stomping across the floor, I want what I want and I want it right now. Now, I'm not just talking about as a kid. I'm talking about have you done something like that as a grown-up yet? To where you just got really, really upset because you didn't get your way, or you saw a post on something, or I don't know. My guess is that at some point you've done it. It may not have been quite that blatant, but my guess is at some point deep inside of you, you have done something like that. Over the past several weeks, we've been spending some time answering what we believe to be some difficult questions. We've looked at, was Jesus really God? We've looked at, did he really die and rise again? We've looked at whether or not science can disprove the miracles, and kind of approach that question of, is science at odds with faith? These are difficult questions that people are asking, and we're asking them, we're spending the time on them because we believe that buried questions become doubts, and buried doubts become unbelief. So it is important, it is imperative to ask the questions. The timing of this seems even more perfect when I got on a couple of weeks ago and I listened to a message that my own brother was sharing in Kansas. And you know what we didn't talk about it ahead of time, but you know what he was talking about? He was talking about answering the difficult questions that people ask about their faith. And then in that message, he referenced a book by a guy named Craig Rochelle, who's a pastor in Oklahoma City, he's part of Life Church, which is all over the nation. They televise his messages all over the nation to these different locations. And he wrote a book called The Benefit of Doubt. And the benefit of doubt is all about how it's good and it's imperative that we ask difficult questions because, and he didn't say it the same way, but because buried questions become doubts and buried doubts become unbelief, and so therefore it is important to ask questions. So I bought the book and I started reading it, and I'm like, what? Was he like stealing my notes for this? Should I have written this book first and then I could have a bestseller out there finally? It's like I was reading this going, he's inside my head. Or perhaps maybe there's somebody else who's feeding us all of this, who's telling us as pastors that, hey, we need to get this point across, that it is important to ask difficult questions and not to bury those deep down inside. One of the difficult questions that I've heard presented multiple times throughout the course of my life, and actually one of those that one of you wrote down several weeks ago when I said, hey, give us some of your questions that you have, was why is the God of the Bible so angry? And this can be worded in a lot of different ways. It can be worded as, why is the God of the Bible always throwing temper tantrums? Like you open up the pages and you sit there and you go, he's raining down fire on people. He's telling them to wipe out entire nations. He's sending a guy away from everything that he knows because he's angry. He's coming down off of a mountain. He's opening up the earth and he's having people fall into it. Why is the God of the Bible so angry all the time? Now, it can be worded in different ways, and it can actually sometimes be said even as a statement of it's why is the God of the Old Testament so angry? Or the statement can come across as the God of the Old Testament is like this big, angry, judgmental God, but thank goodness there's the New Testament so that Jesus comes along because he's loving and kind and patient. And man, aren't you so glad that God changed when you turn the page into the New Testament? Like, I've heard all of those different ways, or this question presented in all of those different ways, but they all boil down to us wrestling with this idea of why is the God who created all of this, who says, if he is so loving and he is so kind, then why is he so angry all the time? Now, our instinctual response can be to this, and I've given this instinctual response, and maybe you have too, but can be to immediately come to the defense of God. And to immediately kind of give that answer of, well, God's not angry. He has to discipline people for the things that they do. You know, he's kind of like the parent who has to ground their child or spanks their child or takes away their child's cell phone. They're not necessarily angry with their child, but their child did something that they weren't supposed to do, and they had to teach them that that's not okay. In fact, I've disciplined my own children, and in the midst of disciplining them, explained to them, hey, I'm not mad at you. Dad is not angry with you. But I need you to learn that what you did is not okay. To be for someone who contributes good to the society that you live in, I need you to understand that that behavior is not okay. Now, that's not to say that I've never been angry with my kids. I'm just saying that not every time that discipline is handed down am I angry. And so it can be our instinct to come to God's defense and say, well, he's like that parent. He's not really angry with people when he hands down those punishments. He just has to teach us what is right and what's wrong. There's a couple of things that I want to kind of point out, though, when it comes to that response that we have. And number one, and hopefully this one will come across as a comfort for you, number one is that God doesn't need you to come to his defense. God never asked you to come to his defense. He's a big guy. He can handle himself. He doesn't need us to try and explain away his behaviors and try and make people feel all, butterflies and whatever about him when we're thinking about him. He doesn't need us to do that. He never asked us to. What he did ask us to do was to share his hope with the world that's all around us, to be his light to the world that's all around us. For me, that takes away some of the burden off of my shoulders. I don't have to explain away God's actions. But I do believe that we are able to give some perspective to his actions. The other piece the other issue with that response of God isn't angry, he's just disciplining, is that it actually goes against what God says about himself. It's actually incorrect. See, he may not be labeled or be an angry God, but he is a God who becomes angry. Last year, we spent several weeks, I think it was like a month and a half, walking through Exodus 34, 6 and 7, going through two verses, where I believe is one of the most descriptive portions of Scripture when it comes to God describing what his character is like. When he's, kind of standing before us and he's saying, you want to know who I am? You want to know what I'm like? Here it is. And in the midst of that, here's what he says in Exodus 34, 6 and 7. He says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to what? So God must get angry if he's slow to anger. And he hands down punishment. He says it himself. He hands down punishment as a result of what we have done and after his anger. So to sit there and say, God doesn't get angry, his own description of himself. Now, a little bit of a Hebrew reminder of what we talked about last year. This phrase, slow to anger, this isn't just like God is frustrated or God is a little bit annoyed. The Hebrew, I'm not going to give you the actual Hebrew words for this, but the translation, the more literal translation of the Hebrew phrase for slow to anger would be long of nose, which I think is great. I think we should just start saying it that way instead. Or nose burns hot. In other words, what what God is saying about himself is, I have those, I'm slow to get to them, but I have those moments where my face is flushed, my face is hot, and I am burning with anger inside of me. You ever had one of those moments where you feel like you're just like, your face like, oh my goodness, I'm about to just lose it on somebody right now? God says, no, I have those moments of face burning emotional anger. We don't like to think about that with him because we associate anger as a negative emotion. But it's an emotion that God himself admits to. And he doesn't just admit to it once. Consider Exodus 32, verse 9. When God says, I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my what? Oh, I need a little bit more help than that. So that my what? Anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you a great nation. Or how about Isaiah 5:25? The Lord's what? Burns against his people. His face is hot, people. His hand is raised and he strikes them down. The mountains shake and the dead bodies are like refuse in the streets. Yet for all this, his what? Is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. Or consider Ezra 8:22. The gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him. But his great what? Is against all who forsake him. Are you getting the point here yet? Because I'm not done yet. Isaiah 42 verse 25, he says he poured out on them the burning heat of his nose. In Deuteronomy 29:24, all the nations will ask, why has the Lord done this to this land? Why this fierce burning? In Deuteronomy 29:27, it's just a couple verses later, the Lord's what? Burned. His nose burned hot. He experienced the face burning anger. And let's not forget the flood. Let's not forget Sodom and Gomorrah. Let's not forget Korah's rebellion. So yeah, I think as we read through the Old Testament, it is hard to make the argument, it is hard to make the defense that God does not get angry, that God is just frustrated. God does indeed get angry. And once we admit that he does get angry, then we can begin to answer the question that was asked, why is God so angry? Why does he have these moments of anger? I love the way that the Bible Project guys answer this question, or at least begin to answer this question. To quote them, they say, God wouldn't be good if he didn't have strong reactions to evil and injustice. God wouldn't be good if he didn't have strong reactions to evil and injustice. Or Abraham Heschel, a rabbi and Jewish theologian and philosopher, he wrote it this way: the prophets never portray God's anger as something that cannot be accounted for, or unpredictable, or irrational. It is never a spontaneous outburst, but a reaction occasioned by the conduct of humans and motivated by concern for right and wrong. That's a great explanation if it's true. Because in this scenario, in their description of God's anger, it's not a child throwing a tantrum because he didn't get his way. It's not somebody screaming in the face of another person because they said something that hurt their feelings. No, in this description, it is justified, righteous anger. And if we're honest, we would all say that we have experienced anger that we consider to be justified, righteous anger. Maybe I shouldn't go that far as to say all of us. I feel like I can, but I'm not going to do it. Most of us could say that we have experienced moments where we believe that our anger was justified and it was righteous. And what they're saying is that God's anger is always that way. That he is not simply flying off the handle, but we have to answer the question, is that true? Which means we have to look and see what provokes God to anger. What gets him to these moments where his face is burning hot? And I think that it boils down pretty much, as you look through the Old Testament, it boils down to three categories. One of those is that humans physically hurting humans makes God angry. You know, it's easy to look through the Old Testament. I've heard the claim made. I've read the claim multiple times. It's easy to look through and be like, God is just he's some genocidal bully with anger issues when he tells the Israelites to go into the promised land and to wipe out the nations that are there before them. Like, what kind of angry God would do something like that? He's obviously displeased with the people who are there. But why? What provoked him to this point? It's easy to look and say, well, these are innocent people who are losing their lives when the Israelites go in. But were they? Historical evidence suggests that these were people who were sacrificing their children. And I don't just mean like they're not defending their children, or in order for them to have some comforts, they're just not caring about the consequences that it's putting upon their children. I don't just mean that. That's bad enough in and of itself. I mean, they're literally sacrificing their children. Like, we might read through the Old Testament sometime and go, man, that's a lot of dead animals. Like, that's a lot of blood being spilt from these animals. And especially animal lovers, they really don't like that part about the old sacrificial system. Well, these people in the Promised Land, they were doing that too, but they were doing it with their children. See, they weren't slitting the throat of a goat. They were slitting the throat of a kid. And not actually, that's the same thing. They were slitting the throat of a child. My grandpa used to say, I never had any kids. I never owned a goat. So, thank you, Grandpa, for catching me on that one. These weren't innocent people. They were sacrificing their children. They considered rape to be a perfectly acceptable practice. If you see a woman and you want the woman, then take the woman, and nobody's going to fault you for it. And when you're done with her, you can just discard her and she can go on her way. That was an acceptable practice for these people. Murder wasn't something that they batted an eye at. And this didn't just go on for like a year and then God said, hey, let's wipe them out. This went on for hundreds of years. So while it may still make us uncomfortable, and maybe it should make us a little uncomfortable because we are not God, these were not just innocent people that God sent them in to take their land and to wipe them out. Or consider the story of Cain. It's easy to look at the story of Cain and be like, why would God respond in such a way that he would send Cain away from everything that he ever knew? It wasn't because Cain brought the wrong sacrifice. His response to Cain became so severe when Cain killed his brother, when Cain harmed another human. See, Cain had the opportunity to make things right, and instead, Cain flew off the handle and he hurt somebody. He took somebody's life. That's when God got angry with Cain. Now, even though I would argue even that we've become a little bit desensitized to violence in our world. You know, we see it on TV shows all the time. We see it on news when we turn on the news. Even though we've become desensitized to that, I still believe that for the most part, we become pretty angry pretty fast when we ourselves are harmed physically. Or when somebody that we know and love is harmed physically, we can become angry pretty fast and consider that to be justifiable anger. And sometimes we'll even get to that point of anger when we see somebody that we don't know physically hurt. I remember a couple of years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine, was there not anger over the way that they went in and they attacked Ukraine? We saw the flags everywhere. We saw it all over everything. The anger that we felt because a human or humans were physically hurting other humans. When we see a parent hurt a child, do we not become angry even though we don't know that child? Is that justified? These are the kind of things that make God angry, but he also, it's not the only kind of thing, he becomes angry over oppression. Read through the story of Scripture, and on the surface, when you get to the Egyptians, it looks like, man, his response is harsh here. Plagues, death, destruction of an entire economy when he removed their workforce. Like, that seems like some pretty extreme response here, but consider that for over 400 years, the Egyptians had been putting the Israelites into slavery. The Egyptians had been oppressing the Israelite people. This wasn't a bunch of people who were doing nice things to people and then all of a sudden had some dire consequences for the things that they did. No, the oppression that God saw when he looked down and gave them opportunity to confess and to move away from, the oppression that he saw boiled up the anger inside of him, similar to what we at least should. I guess I can't always say that we do, but that we should feel when we look at the numbers of young people and women especially who are put into sex trafficking every day. Or when we look at modern day slavery, or our own nation's history with slavery. The kind of things that I think a lot of us would say should boil up an anger inside of us. It doesn't necessarily, because truthfully, out of sight, out of mind, right? But not for God. Those are the kinds of things that God sees, and as we look through Scripture and as we're looking at why is he angry, he's angry because people are oppressing people, and that's not the way that he designed this to be. That's not the way we were supposed to treat one another and live with one another. It's not the way that he sees us. He doesn't see one as being higher than another and therefore being able to exert their power over another. And it makes him angry when he sees it. And we also see God getting angry when consistently covenants are broken. I know we don't use the word covenant all that often anymore, but this word covenant essentially means when the deepest of promise is broken over and over and over again. And I don't just mean like the promise that a kid will give, yes, I promise to wash my hands after I go to the bathroom when I'm at school, and then they run into the bathroom and they go to the bathroom and they leave the bathroom and they don't wash their hands and they break their promise. Or the promise that husbands everywhere make that I will put the toilet seat down after I go to the restroom, and then the wife goes in the middle of the night and she sits down. Now technically you could say that could cause physical harm to another individual. I'm told that it hurts when you sit down on a toilet seat or a toilet that has the seat up. So you could put it under that, but I'm not talking about those kinds of promises. I'm talking about like the marriage level commitment promises. See, as we read earlier about the times that he said, hey, I'm angry. Like the one in Exodus 32, when he wanted to be left alone with these people so he could wipe them out. And then have Moses start a new nation in that one. See, this was after they had decided to give all the credit for the life that they were now living, not in slavery, that they were going to give all the credit to a calf made out of gold. And say that this is a representation of the God who led us out of slavery, took us through a sea that was divided and wiped out our enemies while he did it, that fed us where there was no food to give us, that gave us something to drink when there was no water to drink. Like our response to all of that was to say that we will worship this God only. And then they broke it. Now you might sit there and go, man, that sounds like a pretty selfish thing for this God to get upset about, pretty arrogant thing for this God to get upset about. But husbands, wives, when that commitment is made, don't you expect that the love that they profess to have for you and are committed to have for you will be saved for only you? Or are you going to be okay with it when a week into your marriage, they're sitting there over there going, well, you know what? I actually love this person. I'm going to hold on to my love for so-and-so, and I'm going to keep that in my heart. Of course not. God's anger starts to show up in this when they make a promise, and they break a promise, and they make a promise, and they break a promise, and they make a promise, and they break a promise, and they make a promise, and they break a promise, and eventually he gets a little frustrated. And eventually, he gets a little angry, just like we would do. In fact, I would say that I've grown angry over people who have made the same promise and broken the same promise that was a whole lot less important than that one. I can think of some of the silly promises that people have made to me, and then they broke them, and then they made it again, and they broke it again, that I eventually just I'm done with this. I'm over it. I'm over having this discussion. I'm frustrated. I'm angry. And God is angry as well over the consistent broken covenant, the betrayal of the covenant that we made with him. So is the God of the Old Testament angry? That was the question. I guess the question was actually why. And I think we can look and say, this is why. Is he angry? Absolutely, sometimes. But is he always angry? I mean, that's what the question was. Why is he always so angry? And I would say he's not always angry. He describes himself as slow to anger. So is he slow to anger? Is he telling the truth on that? Or is the person asking the question of why is he always angry? He's saying he's slow to angry. Which one is more accurate? Now, I believe that in this room, the oldest individuals are in their 80s. Am I wrong on that? Is there anyone in their 90s or 100s in here? Okay, that's what I thought. So the eldest of us is in our 80s sitting in this room. The youngest of us, I would say, is, well, okay, there's some really young. I'm not even going to try and guess. There's some in the single digits for a little bit longer as she's walking out. Now everybody turns. Sorry, Kaylee. So 80 max. 80 years max. How many times has your face burned hot? However long you've lived. How many times would you say you've gotten to that point where, and I would slam on the table, but last time I did that, I broke my table. But where you're like, slam on the table, I am so mad, like I'm shaking right now. How many times have you gotten face burning hot in your life? I know you can't actually come up with a number, but my guess is there's been at least a few. I know it's easy to think that this is just several hundred pages. And man, we run into a lot, maybe would be your definition, of how many times God grows angry. But consider that this covers several thousand years in those hundreds of pages. Thousands of years of people breaking their promises. Thousands of years of people hurting one another. Thousands of years of people oppressing one another. I'm kind of shocked that we only see the number of circumstances that we see when we read through it. Because if we were God, we probably would have wiped the people out a whole lot more. The consequences would have been a whole lot worse. But fortunately, thankfully, we can turn the page and we can head into the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, we see Jesus. We see Jesus who is loving and who is patient. We see Jesus who doesn't grow angry. Jesus who laid down his life for... That's not the story. In fact, what we see is a Jesus who is a replica of the Father in the Old Testament. This is Jesus who flipped over tables when people were oppressing others and they were breaking their covenant promises. You can read that story in Matthew 21 and Mark 11. This is Jesus who, it says, looked at them in anger because they were more concerned with ritual than the goodwill of a man in Mark 3:5. This is Jesus who, it says, was indignant when they tried to push the little children away from him in Mark 10:14. This is Jesus who is an exact replica of the Father who came to save those who were lost, but who became angry when humans took advantage of other humans and when humans put ritual above the life of another person. And this is Jesus who, yes, he came to save, but who will one day come back to judge. Who will one day come back to say what the punishment will be for the actions of men and women. In his own description, in John chapter 5, he says that the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, and he has given him authority to judge because he is the Son of Man. And what will that look like? What will that judgment look like? According to Jesus himself in Matthew 25, some will go away to eternal punishment. Jesus will make that choice, but the righteous will go away to eternal life. So is Jesus suddenly, because he got angry, and because he's going to be the one who will one day declare what the punishment is for each individual, is he suddenly not a good God? Does that change who Jesus is? Is he suddenly nothing more than an angry God because sometimes his nose burned hot? Or is he still the one who came to give his life as a ransom for all of us? See, he is the same God that we see in the Old Testament. God did not change when we flipped the page. We see in Jesus a 33-year period of time. We see in the Old Testament a period of thousands of years. But we do see the same God in those times. The Apostle Paul once wrote to the church in Rome about this God, about the God that he saw and the God that he witnessed. Do you think lightly of the riches of his kindness and his tolerance and his patience, not knowing that the kindness of God leads you to repentance? Consider who it was who wrote those words. See, this was a guy who had hunted down Christ followers and had them killed. In fact, I asked Pastor Mike this during the course of the week to make sure that I wasn't going a little bit too extreme with this description of Paul. I think that if Paul did today what he had done then, if he had targeted a people group the way that he was targeting a people group back then, we would call him a terrorist. That's who Paul was. Well, that's who Saul was. Until he met Jesus. Until he met the same God that is in the Old Testament. And when he met that same God, he didn't run into an angry, judgmental, punishing, I'm going to wipe you out, I'm going to chop off your head, any of that stuff. He didn't run into a God like that. He ran into a God that he saw as kind and tolerant and patient. Paul would have been a perfect candidate to be eliminated. And nobody would have batted an eye. In fact, there would have been a lot of people celebrate it, much like a lot of Americans celebrated it when Osama bin Laden was tracked down and taken out. That would have been their feelings if Paul had been eliminated, but he wasn't. Instead, he came before the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, the same God, and he was humbled and repented because of it, which is exactly the desire that God has. His desire is not to wipe out all the evil. In fact, in his words in Ezekiel 33:11, he says that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. I remember coming across this verse when people were celebrating the death of Osama bin Laden. And I read this and I went, is that how God feels right now? See, God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and they live. God's greatest desire in this world is to be with us, to be in union with us. See, when he hands down discipline and he hands down consequences, he's, in the words of parents everywhere, it hurts him more than it hurts us. He's not finding delight in it. He's not finding joy in it. It pains his heart when the punishment has to come down. Is he sometimes angry? Yes. But that doesn't mean that he delights in handing down the punishment that comes as a result of our sin. If he did, I don't believe that he would have sent his son to die for us. Because remember, that's how Jesus describes the scenario. is that the Father, the God of the Old Testament, sent Jesus for us. That angry God sent Jesus for us. Church, I believe that we can actually find some comfort in the anger that we see God display. Because I believe that it shows us that He cares about the violence and the oppression and the broken promises that are all around us. And it shows us that we should care too. He tells us in Micah 6:8, what is good? I've shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does He require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. See, God's response in injustice and anger, and that means that that's an okay response for us too. I feel like we're taught one of two extremes most of the time. One extreme is that it's okay to get angry about everything. The person got your order wrong at the restaurant and you should just bash them and be angry at them. Or the mailman put your mail in the wrong spot and you should be angry at them. Or we're taught the other extreme of you should never be angry. You should walk around kind of skipping and snapping your fingers and everything's good. I feel like we're taught one of those two extremes, but that's not the example that God lays out for us. By His example, anger is an appropriate emotion when harm is done to other people. When a child is abused or a spouse is abused, when there is murder, rape, or abortion, God says anger is an appropriate response. And when people are oppressed, He says anger is an appropriate response. When there is slavery, when there is sex trafficking, when there's classism or sexism or racism or all the other isms out there, when those are out there, anger is an appropriate response. And He says when covenants are broken, when we see our high divorce rates and our broken treaties and Christians publicly attacking one another, anger is an appropriate response. It is an appropriate emotion for us to feel, but what we do with it matters. And how do we know what the appropriate response to it is? How do we know what to do with it? How do we know when it's okay to be angry? We follow His lead. If I can be blunt for just a moment with my diagnosis of the world that we live in, is that some of us just seem to live angry. We seem to be looking for reasons to gripe and to vent about how life didn't perfectly go my way. We seem to look for reasons to throw temper tantrums. You know, our news stations, my diagnosis, our news stations are designed to get us angry and to rile up the Democrats at the Republicans and the Republicans at the Democrats and to make the United States hate the president or hate Canada or hate Mexico or hate Russia. It's almost as if they're designed to rile that up within us. And in our social media, it's almost as if it has turned into being designed for the same purpose, to just rile people up against one another. This is my spot to be able to go on and to vent about how some oftentimes really small, ridiculous wrong was done to me, but I want to get everybody on my side over this thing. And so I'm going to make sure everybody knows about it. And if you don't support my anger, well, now I'm angry at you. And you're not a true friend if you can't get behind how I feel about this. It's almost as if the enemy wants us to be angry at one another. And he wants us to hate one another. Our nation seems to be a boiling pot of anger. And that enemy is loving every second of it. Every second of it. But as Christ followers, something should be different. Something about us should be different about how we handle this. Again, it's okay to be angry, but are we slow to anger? Let's not forget how slow God is to getting angry. Are we loving? Are we patient? Are we kind? Are we merciful? Or do we just go 0 to 60 on revenge and retribution? In fact, let's not make that question rhetorical. What about you? Don't make excuses. I want you to stop and look at yourself through the eyes of another person who sees the way that you respond to situations that come up in life, who sees the words that you say, the redness of your face, the posts that you make. Would they see somebody who is slow to anger? Would they see someone who is loving and patient and kind and merciful? God's greatest desire is to be with us, and He longs for us to be at peace with one another. As long as it is possible for you, as far as it depends on us, we read, live at peace with everyone. Why? The question was, why is God so angry? Maybe the better question would be, why, in the face of so much evil, why is He still kind and loving and patient? As His image bearers, is our goal to be the same? Again, it's not rhetorical. It's a question that I hope that we will wrestle with this week.